There is a reason your soulmate is suddenly looking at the past differently, and it has nothing to do with the words you said before you walked away. It is something they recently discovered about what you were doing when they thought you were simply living your life, waiting or quietly accepting the distance between you. They are beginning to realize that while they were focused on what you said, you were silently giving up things you never told them about. And that discovery has left them completely shocked, because the version of the story they carried in their mind was simple. They believed you cared, you stayed for a while, things became complicated, and eventually you left. But now something no longer fits that explanation. They are remembering the moments you changed your plans without making a big deal about it. The times you stayed available when you could have chosen something else. The opportunities you quietly ignored, the comfort you sacrificed, the people you kept at a distance because some part of you was still emotionally connected to them. You never stood in front of them and said, "Look what I gave up for you." You never kept a record of your sacrifices. You simply carried them in silence because you believed that if the connection was real, one day they would understand without needing you to explain everything. Imagine someone walking beside you through a storm while secretly giving you their only umbrella. You feel protected, but you never realize they are the one getting soaked. That is the truth they are beginning to see now. You were not simply present in this connection. You were paying a price for it. And the most shocking part is that they are only discovering the first sacrifice. Because what they have not yet realized is that you may have given up something far more personal than your time, your comfort, or your peace. And now the truth is beginning to become impossible for them to ignore. They are starting to understand that the things you sacrificed were not always dramatic enough for anyone to notice. There was no announcement, no grand gesture. No moment where you stood in front of them and said, "I gave this up because of you." That is what makes the realization so powerful. You were making sacrifices in ordinary moments, in decisions that looked small from the outside, but carried a completely different weight inside you. You changed your plans and pretended it was nothing. You made time when you were already exhausted. You stayed emotionally available when you had every reason to protect yourself. You ignored opportunities because a part of you was still holding space for the possibility of this connection becoming something more. And perhaps they never knew. They saw the fact that you stayed, but they never saw what you had to give up in order to stay. Imagine carrying a heavy suitcase through an entire journey while smiling at the person walking beside you, never telling them how much it weighs, because you are afraid that if you stop to put it down, the entire journey might end. That is what you were doing. You were carrying things quietly because you did not want your love to feel like a transaction. You did not want to say, "Look at everything I have done for you." You wanted them to choose you freely, not because they felt guilty about what you had sacrificed. And that is why the discovery is affecting them so deeply now. They are beginning to look back at moments they once considered ordinary and realize that they were not ordinary to you at all. The time you gave them may have been time you could have spent somewhere else. The chances you gave them may have been chances you denied to yourself. The peace you sacrificed may have been the very peace you needed most. And the painful part is that you may have made these choices without ever knowing whether they would lead anywhere. You were not guaranteed a future with them. You were not promised that your patience would be rewarded. You simply believed the connection was important enough to keep protecting. They thought you were staying because it was easy, but now they are beginning to understand that you were staying because you were willing to carry what they could not see. And perhaps this is why your silence is becoming so difficult for them to understand. They may have asked themselves why you never told them what you were giving up. Why did you never complain? Why did you never make them feel responsible? Why did you keep pretending that everything was fine? The answer may be simpler and more painful than they expect. You did not want to love them with a list of sacrifices in your hand. You did not want every act of love to become evidence in an argument. You wanted to give because you genuinely cared. But somewhere along the way, you began to realize that the person receiving your sacrifices did not even know they were being made. And that realization changes a person. Because there is a difference between giving from love and constantly disappearing inside what you give. You may have started asking yourself questions you never wanted to ask. How much longer can I keep doing this? How much of myself can I give away before there is nothing left that feels like mine? And now, as your soulmate begins to discover the truth, they are facing the part of the story they never expected. They are realizing that you did not simply sacrifice things for the connection. You were slowly sacrificing pieces of the life you could have been living without them. And the next realization may be the one that shocks them most, because they are beginning to understand that the greatest thing you gave up was not an opportunity, a person, or even your peace. It was your need to be chosen by them. And this is where the truth becomes even more difficult for them to accept, because the greatest sacrifice you made was not something they could see from the outside. It was not simply your time, your plans, your comfort, or the opportunities you quietly let pass. The deepest thing you sacrificed was your need to be chosen by them. For a long time, a part of you may have been waiting for that moment. The moment they would finally understand what you felt. The moment they would stop hesitating. The moment they would choose you without confusion, without mixed signals, without making you question where you truly stood in their life. You may have imagined what it would feel like to finally hear the words you had been waiting for. You may have believed that if you were patient enough, understanding enough, loyal enough, and loving enough, eventually the uncertainty would disappear. But there comes a point where waiting begins to cost more than leaving. And that is the point your soulmate may now be discovering you reached long before they realized you were gone. Imagine standing at a train station for years, watching the tracks, believing that one particular train will eventually arrive. You keep checking the schedule. You keep telling yourself that the delay does not mean the train is never coming. But one day you stop looking at the clock. You do not stop remembering the journey you hope to take. You simply realize that your entire life cannot remain at the station, waiting for something that may never arrive. That is what happened inside you. You did not necessarily stop loving them. You stopped allowing your life to depend on whether they would finally make a decision. And this is the part that may shock them the most. They may have assumed that because you still cared, you were still waiting. They may have believed that your heart was permanently connected to the possibility of them returning. But they are beginning to understand that love and waiting are not the same thing. You can love someone and still stop expecting them. You can miss someone and still continue your life. You can remember a connection and still decide that you will never again lose yourself trying to keep it alive. You did not stop loving them because someone else replaced them. You stopped waiting because you finally realized that your own future could not remain paused for someone who had not decided whether they wanted to be part of it. And perhaps this is why their discovery is creating such a powerful reaction inside them. They are realizing that the person they thought would always be emotionally available may have finally released the hope they depended on. They may have assumed that no matter how much time passed, some part of you would still be standing in the same place, looking back. But now they are beginning to wonder if you have finally moved beyond the version of the future that included them. That question can be more painful than rejection, because rejection says no, while your silence leaves them wondering whether they have simply arrived too late. They may be asking themselves what you sacrificed while waiting for them to choose you. How many opportunities did you ignore? How many people did you turn away? How many times did you silence your own needs because you were still hoping the connection would become what you believed it could be? And now they are beginning to understand that the final sacrifice was not your love. It was your willingness to keep sacrificing everything else for the possibility of receiving theirs in return. The moment you stopped waiting, something inside the connection changed forever. Because now, even if they finally understand what you gave up, They may be realizing that understanding you is no longer enough to bring back the person who once waited so patiently for them, and now the realization is beginning to turn into something much heavier for them. It is no longer just surprise. It is the uncomfortable feeling of looking back at the past and realizing that they were receiving things they never understood the value of at the time. They are remembering how often you made yourself available, how many times you protected their feelings, how many moments you chose silence instead of saying something that might have created conflict. They are beginning to see that while they believed everything was simply continuing naturally, you were quietly carrying the emotional weight of the connection. You were the one making excuses when things became confusing. You were the one giving another chance when disappointment would have been understandable. You were the one trying to keep the connection alive during moments when it would have been easier to walk away. And now they may be asking themselves a question they never expected to ask. How did I not see what this person was giving up for me? Imagine receiving a gift every day from someone without ever asking where it came from. You simply accept it, become accustomed to it, and eventually begin to believe it will always be there. Then one day, you discover that the person giving it to you had been going without something essential just to make sure you had it. That is the kind of realization beginning to reach your soulmate now. They may be discovering that your comfort was often created by your own discomfort. They were able to remain calm because you were carrying the tension. They believed everything was fine because you were constantly hiding the parts of yourself that were no longer fine. They thought you were naturally patient because they never saw how many times you had to fight the urge to give up. And perhaps the most painful part is that you never wanted them to feel guilty. You did not want your sacrifices to become a weapon against them. You did not want to stand there and say, "After everything I have done for you, how could you treat me this way?" You wanted them to choose you because they genuinely wanted to, not because they felt obligated by everything you had quietly given. That is why your silence is now becoming so meaningful to them. They may be realizing that the things you never said were not empty spaces. They were full of emotions you were protecting them from. Every time you said, "It is okay," there may have been something inside you that was not okay at all. Every time you acted like you understood, you may have been hiding how deeply something had hurt you. Every time you gave them another chance, you may have been giving up another piece of your own certainty. And now they are beginning to understand that the person they thought was simply loving them was also constantly adjusting themselves to keep the connection from breaking. This is where shock can begin to turn into regret. Not necessarily because they never cared, but because they are finally seeing the size of what they received without understanding the cost. They may be replaying moments that once seemed insignificant and realizing that you were sacrificing more than they ever knew. And the thought that may be haunting them now is this: if they had understood everything you were giving up at the time, would they have treated the connection differently? Because there are some sacrifices that can be acknowledged too late. There are some moments that cannot be returned. And there is one final sacrifice they may not yet understand, the version of you that was willing to keep giving, keep waiting, and keep believing forever. And now the final truth is beginning to come into focus, and this may be the part that affects them more deeply than anything else. They are beginning to understand that you did not simply sacrifice things to keep the connection alive. You sacrificed parts of yourself while hoping the connection would eventually become something you could both fully choose. You gave your time, your patience, your understanding, your opportunities, your peace, and perhaps even your ability to move forward freely. But the greatest sacrifice was the version of you that believed you could keep giving forever without eventually becoming exhausted. You may not regret loving them. You may not regret the memories you shared. You may not even regret the things you gave up, because at the time they came from a place of genuine love. But you now understand something you did not understand before. Love should never require you to permanently disappear inside someone else's uncertainty. Imagine a candle burning through the night to guide someone home. The person eventually reaches the destination, but when they turn around, they realize the candle has almost completely burned itself away. That is the realization your soulmate may be facing now. They are beginning to understand that while they were focused on whether you would stay, you were slowly becoming someone who could no longer continue sacrificing yourself just to keep the possibility of the connection alive. And perhaps this is what shocks them most. You did not walk away because the connection meant nothing. You walked away because it meant enough for you to finally understand that losing yourself was not the price love was supposed to demand. They may now be wondering whether you would still make the same sacrifices today. Would you still wait? Would you still rearrange your life? Would you still give up your peace? Would you still choose them over yourself? And somewhere deep inside, they may already know the answer is different now. You may still care. You may still remember. You may still feel something when their name appears in your thoughts. But you are no longer the same person who believed that love meant continuously proving how much you could endure. You have learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is not holding on tighter. Sometimes it is finally releasing what is slowly destroying your peace. And now they are beginning to understand what you sacrificed in silence. They are realizing that you were giving up pieces of your own life for a connection they did not even fully understand they were receiving. They may finally understand your patience. They may finally understand your distance. They may finally understand why you became quiet. But there is one truth they may never be able to change. The version of you who would have continued sacrificing forever no longer exists in the same way. You gave that version of yourself away piece by piece, hoping the connection would eventually meet you where you were. And when it did not, you had to choose what remained. So the question haunting them now may not be whether you ever loved them. They finally know that you did. It may not even be whether you sacrificed for the connection. They are beginning to discover just how much you did. The question is whether they will ever find another person willing to give so much, remain so patient, and carry so much in silence without asking to be seen. Because now they understand the truth. You were never simply someone who stayed. You were someone who kept choosing the connection even when it required you to sacrifice parts of yourself. And when you finally stopped, it was not because the love disappeared. It was because you finally realized that the person you were becoming to keep the connection alive was someone you could no longer afford to lose.